Hello and welcome to Mini Builds, a channel about building software and electronics projects. So in the last episode of the Habitboard devlog, we finished off by creating this simple list of boards in our application. So today we're going to be introducing some state management using the block pattern. So what is state management? As the name suggests, it's just the management of the state, which in Habitboard is simply managing the list of boards and any associated entries. So for example, when we click on this tick symbol, we'll want our state management system to add or remove today's entry associated with that board. So what's the block pattern? So the block pattern is just a way or a pattern that we use to separate the UI from the business logic, which, business logic being the mutation of the state essentially. So the block pattern achieves this by introducing an intermediary between the UI and the state. So the UI will send events or requests to this intermediary, and then that will mutate the state. So for example, in our clicking example, when we click the tick, it'll send a request to this intermediary, essentially saying, please add or remove today from that board, and then that will notify the state or modify the state, which will then be passed back to the intermediary and ultimately passed back to the UI for it to re-render. So let's take a look at the documentation for the block pattern or block library. So if we check it out on pub.dev and we just search for block, and I think the blocklibrary.dev website has got some pretty good diagrams and everything. So we'll copy that for in a moment. So yeah, here we are. Here's a nice diagram of what I was describing. So we have the UI and this intermediary, and then essentially the state. And the UI sends, events or calls functions in the qubit case, which then sends requests to the state, which responds, and ultimately the new state is sent back to the UI for it to re-render. So let's add the dependency for Flutter block. And we'll have to do a pub get to get it to actually pull down the dependency. Cool, which looks to be done. We'll sort of do a similar thing to what we did with our model and just put everything in a Dart file called state. We will create our state object, which is just going to be a list of boards at the moment. And then we'll copy this qubit example. And instead of being called counter qubit, we'll call it Habitboard qubit. And instead of an int, this will actually be our Habitboard state. And we'll have the initial state as just a sort of empty state like that. Actually, we'll have our initial state as just containing one board. And we'll call it that. So now we're going to replace our list in our main page with and instead get it from the qubit. So the first thing we need to do is add the block provider to our main method. So let's copy that and go back to our code. So in here we are going to essentially do this. Cool. So what this has done is created a block provider providing our qubit to our app itself. Cool. So go back to the documentation. We should have an example of where it uses the block builder. So we will replace our list of blocks with the block builder instead. Which will have that, and then our habit board state. Let's have the type parameter. And then we need to provide a builder. Seem to always get a bit muddled up with these widget trees and things like that, but there we go, that seems to have done it. So now, instead of using the local list of this.boards, we'll use the state.boards. And for this we'll probably need a hard restart, hot restart. Cool. So now we have our board from block instead of our list of boards. So we can remove that. Just tidy things up a little bit. Cool. So now let's try adding a button to the app bar that will just add a board. So we'll need to add a method to our qubit that allows us to add a board. So let's just take another look at the documentation for that. So yeah, these methods are void and they just emit a new state. Cool. Call emit anyway. Call this method add board. It will obviously take a board. And it will emit a new instance of habit board state, but with the previous state with more boards in it. And it should be emitting that. So we need, in our widget tree, we ultimately need to get the qubit here and call add board on it. So let's see how we do this. So presumably we can do this. then call add board. And we just give this, well, I'll just call it new board for the moment. Cool, so let's see if that works. So what we should see is we click add board, that will essentially call this add board method on the qubit, mutating the underlying state and then returning it back to the UI and adding a new board to this list. And it did, that's good. Nice. Cool. Now is probably as good a time as any to introduce entries into the mix. So let's go over to our model file and create a class called entry. And it will just have a date time field, and we'll add a list of entries to the board object. And we will add a method to the board to check whether today is checked, basically. Actually, we just pass in a date. Annoyingly, there doesn't appear to be a just date object in Dart, just there's only date time, so we'll do some like weirdness like this, but it's fine. Cool, so let's use this method to make our ticks either green or grey, depending on whether this returns true or false. So if it is checked, we'll return green. Otherwise we'll just return grey. And interesting. Let's do a hot restart. So the problem is one of our existing entries, our existing boards has a entry field that's null, and the reason is because it was created before the board had that field. So if we just do a restart, it should be fine. There we go, cool. So in our add board, we'll add an entry that is today, so that hopefully the new ones will be green. Cool, there we go, that's good. So our next job will be to essentially implement ticking this, changing the board. So let's go over to our board object, and we add a method just called toggle, and then pass in a date time. So we find the existing entry, if one exists. otherwise we'll remove the existing entry. And then we'll have to add a method to our qubit to call this function. I must admit, this doesn't look great to me, but we'll roll with it for the moment. So now we need to add a listener to these clicks, these ticks I mean, that will call this toggle date method. We'll add a gesture. Add a gesture detector. Yeah. It has a on tap method. And then we can do a similar thing to what we did up here. Just call the toggle date method. So with any luck, now if we tick one of these, it will change colour, which is pretty cool. Just did a little bit of research, so it turns out there is, unsurprisingly, an icon button, so I'll remove this gesture detector and replace it with the icon button. Cool, and that sort of sorts out the ripple. So it sort of looks a bit more interactive, which is good. Cool, so that looks like a good place to stop for now. In the next episode, we're probably looking to navigating to a new page. So when we click on one of these boards, it'll open up a new page, it'll have a calendar in it, and that will allow us to sort of change other dates other than today. Cool, thanks for watching.